Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I've heard it said that if you want to work in television or film these days, you need to adapt or die. This doesn't mean you have to change to fit the tastes of modern audiences, or keep up with current trends or technology. What it literally means is that if you're pitching a concept to a production company or network, you'd better be adapting an established property, or your project is likely to be dead on arrival. Say if you're not hoping to create a prequel, sequel, spin-off, the much-dreaded reboot, you'll want to present an adaptation of something with a pre-existing audience. It seems like executives are less and less willing to take a risk on an original idea. They can cut corners and use name recognition to fill seats. Don't get me wrong, when I moved out here, I had every intention of making my own way on my own. I came with my own show bibles and series synopses. I started out on the web, and when people started digging my work, I began aiming higher. Little did I suspect that of all the projects I would be hired to write, none of them would actually turn out to be mine. That's how I was introduced to the concept, adapt or die. Early on, I got work converting the lesser-known works of Hans Christian Andersen into a modern television crime drama. Thumbelina became a diminutive, tough-talking rookie on a corrupt police force that only she could clean up. The Ugly Duckling was reimagined as a promising young ballet dancer, threatened by a mob boss named Little Klaus. Every word I hammered out felt like a nail in my own creative coffin, but the studio loved it. When production wrapped on the first season, I swore on everything I held sacred that I would never do anything like that again. A few tense years scrambling for work changed that. And the next big job I took on involved corrupting a 1970s children's puppet show about whimsical Vikings. Under monetary duress, I transformed it into an action-packed major motion picture sex extravaganza, starring some fly-by-night starlet who was far more adept at showing skin than choosing scripts. After that, I stopped pretending I had standards. This was what led me to Tybalt Ward. As the legend went, Mr. Ward had come over to the United States from the Czech Republic when he was a young man. Having only a box of old drawing pencils to his name, he took to drawing caricatures of anyone willing to drop a few coins into his tin. Eventually, his artistic skill would catch the attention of the local newspaper, which gave him his first real job as a staff cartoonist. It was a rags-to-riches story I would love to explore as a character piece. A film about the rise of a young immigrant escaping some unknown old-world persecution would have been a nice change of pace from the recycling dump my office had become. Unfortunately, it was not meant to be. Mr. Ward had become somewhat well known for a comic strip he had initially created for the paper. One that got him a few book deals and saw his work reprinted across the country in various outlets. Fresh Catch was the name. I suppose it was clever at the time. And the bad wordplay certainly didn't detract from the strip's staying power. The 80s even saw a Fresh Catch cartoon, though. It only aired for one season before being replaced by something equally saccharine. They changed the name to Tuna Toons as well, which seemed an odd choice. I had actually seen the cartoon as a child, though it hadn't made enough of an impression to be remembered. It wasn't until I was offered the job of adapting Fresh Catch into a live-action film that memories of the short-lived show came creeping back into my brain. It was essentially a Tom and Jerry setup, back when that was actually a new concept. The comic strip featured a small group of anthropomorphic tuna fish who would engage in ocean-related wordplay and would be involved in various slapstick scenarios. Where Garfield had pies in the face and hating Mondays, the Fresh Catch fish would constantly fall for fishing hooks hidden in everyday items they may want to keep. I bought a couple collections of the strip to prepare myself for the project. I could spot an oft-used formula right away. Panel 1. Tuna fish looking at a random item they would like to keep. Panel 2. Tuna gives the setup for a pun or wordplay. Panel 3. Tuna tries to take the item, but gets snared by a hook and is whisked off panel. Panel 4. Remaining tuna deliver the punchline, seemingly with no regard to their lost friend. I didn't see much material to work with in terms of an overarching storyline for a feature-length film, but inventing a plot was something I had gotten very used to. Just flay the concept to a skeleton, then slap some mystery meats back onto it, and you've got your own literary Frankenstein's monster. The villain of the comic strip, the Gargamel, or Lucy Van Pelt, as it were, was a grizzled old fisherman who also happened to be a buck-toothed beaver man. His name was originally Old Man Dam, but in later strips a more commercially viable moniker stuck. Driftwood, he was eventually called. The stains on his rain slicker and wading boots could have been fish guts, but it's more likely they were just crudely drawn splashes of water. The weird thing about this comic strip, as opposed to the aforementioned Tom and Jerry, is that sometimes the Beaver Man won. Every so often, the strip would actually end with Driftwood catching and canning one of the tuna characters. It was always some one-off fish who didn't appear in the strip before or after, but I found it to be a disturbing creative choice nonetheless. The cans would go on a shelf in the beaver character's fishing shack, along with many others he'd managed to catch. I was just glad he never seemed to eat any of them. No one the kids reading the strip could see, at least. I figured it would be easy enough in the end. A nuclear family of live-action actors goes out on their boat one day for a wholesome family vacation. A storm hits and they're magically transported to an island where they meet a bevy of annoying CGI tuna who will not shut up. Driftwood and his gang of dockworker otters menace the happy, colorful tuna fish, and eventually the family saves them. Roll credits. Move. Merchandise. Early talk behind the scenes had Ryan Reynolds as the father, and I hear tell that Ice Cube might lend his voice to a rapping tuna. Then I met the illustrious Mr. Ward. I've sat down with plenty of weirdos in my time. Studio execs who are obviously coked out of their minds. Eccentric actors who want to pick my brain about how their pointless and forgettable characters would behave, and so on, and so on. Mr. Ward was different. He lived in squalor, which was surprising considering the modest legacy he had created for himself. I suppose whatever deals he had made as a young man were short-sighted, not all that beneficial to him. His home looked all but abandoned, the yard full of random debris and clusters of rusted old rain barrels. I realized when I pulled into his bumpy dirt driveway how far I had truly traveled from any sign of civilization. Apparently, Mr. Ward enjoyed solitude. I can understand being drawn to the peace and quiet of wooded property on the outskirts of town, but suffice it to say, it's not for me. I couldn't imagine an elderly person living so far away from any form of medical assistance by choice. The old man was insufferable, crooked and gnarled like the dead trees outside his rundown house. Mr. Ward looked like someone who should have been afraid of a random stranger like myself. Instead, he was quite the opposite, barking at me to get inside before I let in the mosquitoes, demanding I take a seat and stop acting nervous. It was difficult to believe a somewhat funny comic strip had come out of such a humorless old man. I was deeply regretting the decision to look him up even before he insisted I drink bitter, stale tea from a cup with a crusted over lip. To say that Mr. Ward's visage was unpleasant is something of an understatement. It wasn't the ruddy, wrinkled skin or the wild brow and ear hair that put me off. It was the scowl. A scowl so overstated and outlandish that it would have been more at home on a drawing of driftwood than on a human face. Especially since they seemed to share the same two prominent front teeth. "You must be wondering why I asked to meet with you," I croaked, choking down the scalding water that was barely passable as a legitimate beverage.
"No."
Mr. Ward shook his head, taking his own cup and shaking hands.
"You're one of the movie men. The last in a long line of snake oil salesmen who wish to bastardize my work."
Ha 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 ha. I chuckled awkwardly. It was clearly not a joke, and I already knew that. "I know what you mean." I tried to relate to the old man. Believe me, the last thing I wanted to do with my career was adapt other people's ideas. But, hey, look at it this way. You're the first creator I can actually sit down and talk to. You can tell me what you do or don't like, and maybe I can change this or that according to your opinions. Mr. Ward sat back for a moment, breath whistling through his nose, as he seemed to consider my words. It was like watching a very old, dried-out gourd trying to process a head full of burrowing mites.
"What I would like from you would be for you to leave my work alone. You will not adapt it. You will not ruin it. You will not corrupt it. You do not create. You destroy. If you have any respect for people who actually dream, who invent, you will not put your hands on my characters or my world."
Slightly taken aback, I defended a process I deeply hated. Sure, the end product I would produce was going to be intellectual garbage, but I had seen the comic strip, and it wasn't exactly comedy gold. Well, don't you want your story to reach a wider audience? A new generation of children? Surely you created the comic strip to bring joy and laughter to kids, so why not let others take up the project and grow the viewer base?
These doodles, they may seem small and ridiculous to you. To me, they are very important. There is a piece of myself in these strips. Even poorly made doll or shirt that bears my creation rips another piece of my work away from me. It becomes less special, less meaningful.
The discussion was tense, and it dragged on for an hour or more. As cranky as Mr. Ward was, he was far from stupid. So, in the end, he knew that no matter how much he objected, the rights to his work hadn't belonged to him in a very long time. The most he could really hope to do was guide my hand a bit. Eventually, he relented and did give me some advice about the project. Mostly he spoke of the way the strip represented real life and the truth of human nature. My God. I had to stifle a laugh or two here and there. He clearly thought quite highly of himself.
The fish can be smart, but they are easy to manipulate. It is integral to the story that you show that they are victims of their own wants and compulsions. The boys are caught by things like baseballs, toy trucks, trinkets that catch their eye.
Then the old man's outdated opinion started to show through.
The girls, they desire things like beautiful dresses, cakes, and candies. They are also not as wily as the boys. Not as clever. Women frequently cause problems that the men must step in and solve.
When I was content, if not comfortable with the information and opinions I had received, I said my goodbyes and promised Mr. Ward he would be happy with the final product. I'm sure neither he or I actually believed that. In the following weeks, I set to work on an early draft of the script. As mentioned, I went with the family gets sucked into a land of adventure thing. I got word the Driftwood was going to be a live-action character, which meant no gnawing down trees or flattening people with his tail, unless I wanted to make the actor very uncomfortable. I also removed the morbid concept of Driftwood catching and canning the tuna fish children would no doubt become attached to. Sending kids out of the theater in tears wasn't really a good way to sell more tickets. Instead, I threw in a foreboding threat of selling the island to developers as the villain's main motivation. It's worked for pretty much every other children's property ever written. I had to admit that while most of the original creator's words about not adapting his work and preserving outdated gender roles fell on deaf ears, something about the whole thing did cause me to rethink something. Maybe this time, and just this time, I would leave my name off the finished film. A pseudonym would work, and while I was more than ready to accept the paycheck, there would realistically be little to no notoriety to claim from this. Maybe disassociating myself was an easy, perhaps lazy, form of protest, but it was protest nonetheless. I had just finished my first draft when the phone rang. It happened so perfectly that if I had seen it in a story, I would have never believed it could happen. The moment I typed the final D in end, the ring snapped me out of my creative focus. Tybalt Ward was dead, and the movie was off. The timing was even more unbelievable than that of the call. At first, I saw little reason to cancel the film project based on Ward's death alone. Then the details were filled in for me. In his old age, Mr. Ward had clearly been unable to keep his property in acceptable condition. After many warnings, countless fines, and several threats of action, the county finally sent a crew out to remove the junk he had accumulated. There was a gunshot, and they found the man dead at his kitchen table, his empty teacup overflowing with blood. His death was instant. Self-inflicted wound to the head, the barrel clenched between his odd teeth. Mr. Ward didn't kill himself over the county's decision to dispose of his things. Not entirely, anyway. Apparently, the rain barrels I had seen in his front lawn were just the tip of the iceberg. Supposedly, there were others scattered across his backyard, and a shed out back filled with them as well. There were even 2 or 3 barrels stacked in the closets in the house. Inside the barrels? Kids. Many, many children. From as of yet undetermined decades. It would be a very long time before they could all be identified. But some were in such a state of decay that Mr. Warren must have been at it well back into his years as a cartoonist. It's been over a year now. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the whole thing. All I know is that the Fresh Catch movie is definitely cancelled, with absolutely no plans in the works to revive the project. And I moved on to a sci-fi channel adaptation of that old flying purple people eater song. In all seriousness, they expect me to wring 12 episodes out of that thing. Possibly more, if they're desperate enough. I'm thinking that once it's sorted out, once there's some more insight into who these kids were, where they were abducted from, and why Tybalt Ward might have done what he did, maybe I'll revisit the whole thing with fresh eyes. As soon as it's not too soon, as they say. I'm almost positive that I can adapt this into a pretty decent horror movie. Pretty decent.
I've recently acquired my late grandmother's home. She had always promised she'd give it to me, but no one in my family had ever taken it seriously. So they were baffled when, upon the reading of her will, I was bequeathed, among other things, her 3-story Victorian. A few of my relatives were quite jealous of this. At 23, I was a woman with not only a high-paying, steady job, but now I also had a splendid home, one that my grandmother had paid off not 5 years before her death. I was living the dream of everyone at the wake. Yet it was all I could do not to chew my nails off when I first got the news. It may have come as a surprise to the rest of the family, but my grandmother and I knew the reason why she'd left the house to me. I was the only one she had told. I'm the only one who knows about the saints beneath the floorboards. My first and only interaction with saints had been over a decade ago, when I was 10. My mother had driven me down to spend the weekend with Grandma, and I'd brought the family dog Sherbert along. Grandma's house was an hour from ours, and somewhat isolated. Her nearest neighbors were about half a mile away. Close enough that I could see a house in the distance when I stood next to the mailbox, but far enough away that there wasn't much chance of a noise reaching them. Grandma's house was bordered by a small sea of trees on either side, creating a natural fence. The driveway was dirt, and I remember feeling excited as my mother drove closer and closer to what I had dubbed the castle. Though most children find the Victorian style creepy, Grandma's house was a wonderland to me. It was so big that every visit was an adventure, searching to find new rooms and corners. That particular trip, I had been eager to find an entrance to the attic that wasn't crisscrossed with boards and nailed shut. Barely waiting for the car to stop, I threw open the door of the van and ran across the front yard. I jumped up the blue-painted wooden steps, racing around the wraparound porch. I opened the back door, knowing it would be unlocked, and let the screen slam behind me. My grandmother, faithfully working in the kitchen, turned and smiled at me. "You always know just where I am," she chuckled, kneeling down. "Grandma!" I shrieked joyously, running into her arms. "Cookies, right? Cookies?" "Of course," Grandma said, leaning back and patting my shoulders. "Lemon sugar cookies. Your favorite. And a nice way to welcome summer." "Courtney!" my mother sighed from the back door, entering the kitchen. Sherbert followed behind her, trotting over to my side. "You shouldn't run ahead. It's dangerous. This house is very old." "Ridiculous," my grandmother scoffed. "I've kept it in good repair. It'll be standing another 100 years at this rate." "Regardless," my mother insisted, "she should be more careful. She's been getting into trouble lately." "Mom!" I protested, sidling up next to Grandma. "What, you thought you could escape it here?" my mother asked, smiling a little. "It isn't ladylike to be breaking into abandoned houses with your friends." "We're exploring." I said. "You make it sound so bad." "I'd say that a bit of trouble is good for a young one," my grandmother said, pulling me into a one-armed hug. "You worry too much, Clarissa." My mother rolled her eyes. "I should have expected as much." "Well, I'll go get her sleeping things. Try not to lose sight of her, Mom." "Don't worry," Grandma assured her. "We'll be as close as peas in a pod." I grinned up at my grandmother, already tasting the warm sugar cookies she'd prepared. My usual trips consisted of us playing games and Grandma telling stories, as well as gardening and baking. We would go on walks through the fields of flowers that made up her backyard, with Grandma dressed in the clothes of other cultures. Having traveled the world for over a decade, there were still some knickknacks, paintings, and souvenirs that Grandma hadn't gotten around to telling me about. Each visit was brimming with a taste of the world I hadn't yet seen. But, like I said, it was on this particular trip that I didn't go anywhere foreign or tropical. I went into the dark and listened to my grandmother tell a very different kind of story. You know how in horror movies, the dog knows what's happening long before any of the main characters do? My dog wasn't like that. The next afternoon, I discovered an old dumbwaiter made before Grandma's husband bought the place. The Victorian used to belong to a couple of rich sisters who had people wait on them. Grandma had explained the history of the place to me on my last visit, saying that the dumbwaiters, hidden behind fake panels of walling, went either up or down. She'd encouraged me to find them and tell her which way they went. I was delighted to discover my first dumbwaiter in the parlor. It was on the second floor, relatively near the attic. After 10 minutes of slapping wood, I had exhaled in relief at the sound of hollow tapping. I'd been grateful that the panel hadn't been stuck behind wallpaper. With the careful placement of a flathead screwdriver and some muscle, the panel popped open. I coughed the musty smell, waving away the dust as I judged the hole. It wasn't big enough for much more than a dinner platter and a glass of wine. There wasn't a chance of me fitting in there. But one border collie puppy? That was certainly doable. I had been hopeful that Sherbert, despite his size, would be able to knock the panel out from wherever he ended up and give me an idea of the space. I hoped he would end up in the attic and I'd figure out a way to follow him up there. He'd be my adventuring dog and I'd play Nancy Drew. He let me lay him down on the rickety dolly, patient and trusting. I gave him half a biscuit for his obedience and began pulling on the rope of the dumbwaiter. I was disappointed when Sherbert began going down, but kept at it, determined to see the mystery through. He never made a single noise. It took a while for the dumbwaiter to stop, from a kid's perspective. When it finally did, I called out Sherbert's name excitedly, expecting him to bark back. At the silence that followed, I jostled the line of the dumbwaiter, feeling the cable wobble all the way down. This time, I was rewarded with a noise. Hissing, and a skittering sound like claws. Thinking that Sherbert was dealing with squirrels, I began pulling the dumbwaiter up as fast as I could, assuring him that he was being a good boy. When the dumbwaiter finally reached the top, my heart sank as Sherbert wasn't wagging his tail at me. He wasn't jumping out of the dumbwaiter, running to get outside into the fresh air. He was perfectly still. I grabbed Sherbert's limp body and pulled him onto the floor, patting him down for injuries and waiting for him to move. Maybe he was just dazed. Maybe the sudden darkness had made it hard for his brain to react and adjust to the reintroduction of light. I started screaming when I realized that my hands were coming away red. Footsteps slammed against the floorboards, overpowering my screams. My grandmother was suddenly kneeling beside me, demanding what was wrong, what had hurt me, whose blood that was. Sherbert! I sobbed, turning numb. I pressed my hands against his coat. Sherbert! A little sigh left Grandma's lips. Later, I would realize it was a sigh of relief. That dumbwaiter goes down, then. She turned her attention to the dog, a mess of bitten-into flesh, fur, and blood. I watched as she pulled the corpse toward her. Grandma? I squeaked. "Oh no, this won't do," Grandma murmured. She dug her fingers into the large holes in Sherbert's body, pulling out chips of black and yellow. She tossed them on the floor with contempt, splattering the floor with flecks of red. "Coal and fool's gold," she tisked. "That won't do. They don't like dogs." "Grandma, we gotta get him to the vet," I screamed, desperate. "There's nothing to be done," Grandma said soothingly, pushing my hair back as I cried. "The saints took a bite out of him." "Saints?" I warbled. I wiped my nose and flinched, the smell of iron filling my senses. "In the basement," she murmured. "They eat things and give you jewels. They ate babies that nobody wanted. Do you know what a miscarriage is?" I nodded, confusion masking the fear and loss. "Mrs. Daniels had one." "They eat those too," Grandma said. "They like people, not dogs. I only ever gave them the people that nobody wanted. And they gave me enough gold, silver, and gems to live however I wanted." She paused to stare at the empty cavern of the dumbwaiter, then looked back, eyes shining. "If you take care of them, they'll take care of you." I, too, took a moment to look at the dumbwaiter, flinching as Grandma grasped my hand. "Keep them a secret, and you'll get the treasure," I heard her whisper. Beneath her words, there was the sound of skittering and hissing. I refused to turn and look her in the eyes. "You'll be rich, like me. See the world for yourself. You're a smart young girl who loves an adventure. Not like your mother. I'll leave the saints to you." We ended up agreeing to say that Sherbert had wandered into the meadows and had been eaten by wild animals. The forest around Grandma's house was not unknown for its wolves and bears. Grandma's husband had actually met the very same fate decades earlier. My mother and father accepted the news without question, grieving and reminding me to grieve as well. I had left my tears on the wooden floors, though, beside the blood and gold. On any subsequent visits to Grandma's house, I didn't run to meet her. Mom took it as a sign that I was maturing and heeding her advice. Throughout the years, my grandmother winked at me every now and again, reminding me that we shared a secret. We never spoke of the saints aloud, and I tried to purge them from my memory. But it was hard. Whenever I stared at all the beautiful things in her house, I could just imagine the paintings, teapots, and statues, all streaked with red. The blood of babies. Of people that the world didn't want. When I got the news that Grandma had passed, my first instinct was to grab a can of kerosene and light the Victorian from the basement up. Grandma's will was read a day before the viewing. Though it had sickened my stomach to hear her promise to me had been kept, I'll admit I thought, at least it'll be easier to set my own house on fire. The viewing, held in Grandma's home, seemed a little too well planned to my biased eyes to give me the house and then force me to walk through its halls, mingling with people and imagining myself in such splendor. Grandma really had kept it in wonderful condition. And even though her rarer worldly items would be donated to local museums and charities, there was still a fair amount of furniture and accents that would become mine were I to accept. "An Easter egg to begin your own personal house of fortune," the woman in the casket had told me one night over cocoa. I never told her that I wanted the saints. I never said that I wanted riches. But I guess something had slipped through. Something that even I hadn't noticed in my own self-reflections over the years. Maybe it was a family trait that had skipped a generation. Maybe it was simple curiosity that inspired me to cut off a few of Grandma's fingers when everyone went to toast her memory in the kitchen. She had ordered her body to be presented in the parlor on the second floor, right beside the false panel. A truly insidious woman my grandmother had been. The dumbwaiter was clean this time. It went down smoothly on a well-oiled track. I felt the impact of the dolly hitting the floor and waited. This time, the hissing sounded more like singing, like laughter. I pulled up the dumbwaiter to find that my grandmother's words had been true. They definitely prefer people over dogs. Whatever it is beneath the floorboards in this old Victorian, they certainly make beautiful work of ugly things, like a caterpillar into a butterfly. At the reading of the will, along with the deed, I was given a map of the house. Certain rooms had red X's over them, and there was an accompanying written log of the specific location of each X. My family members had been confused, but I knew a treasure map when I saw one. And I know what false paneling sounds like when I hear it. I have everything I need to be a self-made woman, just like my grandmother had been. As I turned the rubies over in my hand, watching them catch the light, I feel a smile cross my face. I know of a rundown neighborhood not 10 miles away. There are people in it who could use my services. No matter the decade, there are always people who can use the help of saints.
Have you ever heard of sleep paralysis? Sleep paralysis is a condition that causes people to be unable to move, either when falling asleep or waking up. It is often accompanied by night terrors and particularly vivid nightmares, all of which can be more than a little disturbing when you find yourself at your most vulnerable and unable to react. Its physical causes remain a mystery, but the condition is sometimes directly related to psychological factors such as built-up stress. I suppose it shouldn't have been much of a surprise that the torment that haunted my early teenage years returned when I moved to a rundown suburban neighborhood in Louisiana. The block I lived on was a textbook example of the frenzied building of the late 90s that led to the subsequent housing crisis. Prices plummeted quickly when the builders realized no one wanted to live near a bog, miles away from any major city. To me, however, it was perfect. Being a web designer meant I could work from home, and although it took a while to get used to using mosquito nets, the house, for its asking price, was a real bargain, and included a porch, a garage, and even a space in the attic that I planned to transform into a home theater and game room. It also allowed me to set my studio and bedroom apart and provided me with extra space if friends wanted to drop by. Fresh out of college and ready to get on with working, it promised to be everything I could wish for, except that it had been so poorly maintained. I'm not talking about superficial, easy-to-fix stuff. Either the soggy paint and weed-infested porch I could take care of myself, but the multiple leaks and crackling wiring represented a whole different sort of beast. Fortunately, my parents came over and some really nice neighbors volunteered to help, probably happy to see a fresh face amongst the row of empty houses. Even the local pastor came by, a chubby little man who served ours and 3 other equally deserted parishes and did his best to keep the small, nearby church from falling into ruin. By the end of the month, my home looked as gorgeous as it could ever be. After several weeks of continuous home repairs and working at my computer, both almost non-stop, and in spite of the clearly friendly, welcoming community, the stress and exhaustion hit me hard. The first night it happened, I woke up in a sweat, as if startled by a distant scream that faded away the moment I regained consciousness. Trying to switch on the light, I found my arm immobilized, buried beneath a tide of blankets that might as well have been made of lead, trapping all my limbs beneath its crushing embrace. I sighed. Not this again. You know that Henry Fuseli painting that depicts a young maiden laying on her bed with a fat, piggish imp sitting over her? The Nightmare, I think it's what it's called. That's what this felt like. A nightmare that's absolutely terrifying as it hits you before you have any idea what's going on. However, I was already what you might call a veteran at this stuff, and as soon as I recognized it for what it was, I tried my best to go back to sleep before I wasted an hour looking at the ceiling wishing I could go back to sleep. I tried counting sheep, trying to mentally solve complex math while forgetting half the numbers, you know, the usual tricks. At last, after a relentless battle, I finally fell into a listless slumber and woke up just as tired as I had been when I laid down. One of the things that makes each sleep paralysis condition unique is its frequency. The luckier of those afflicted will suffer from the condition only once and are then free from it for the rest of their lives, while others, it's a monthly occurrence. My case is fairly peculiar in that it rarely raises its ugly head, but when it does, it comes on full force in strings of consecutive episodes spanning weeks. Well acquainted with the pattern, I expected another restless night. One of the few productive things I did that day was tilting my window blinds slightly so I would be able to spy the magnificent view of chipped paint and overgrown bushes that filled the horizon. All humor aside, this was a trick I'd come up with as a teen. It helped me to cope with my problem. Poster-worthy or not, any view during one of my nighttime episodes was better than complete blackness. And being an early riser by nature, the morning sun wouldn't bother me at all. Nothing unusual happened that night, and I was relieved to wake up refreshed and ready to make up for everything I should have done the day before. Still, I was experienced enough to know that one good night didn't mean the cycle was over. I was careful to not overwork myself. I figured there was a good chance I'd need to conserve some strength. The paralysis did, however, return, as certain as nighttime itself. So there I was again, frozen in my bed, at least this time with enough light in the room to be able to see exactly what time it was. The clock read 3:32 a.m. Not a pleasant surprise, but things could have been worse. The faster I fell back to sleep, I thought, the more rested I'd feel in the morning. Between the blinds, I watched as streetlights projected yellow shapes onto the dirty white walls of the nearby houses, giving ghoulish life to swaying tree branches. I was moments from closing my eyes when something else caught my attention. It was a silhouette of a man or a woman, I couldn't tell, making its way through our empty streets in the dead of night. I remember thinking how odd it was for someone to be out this late, particularly an elderly person, as the heavy, limping stride seemed to indicate. Although I am not typically the type to stick my nose in other people's business, I couldn't help but spy on this figure as it passed. I had nothing better to do, was unable to move, and knew too well that my night's slumber was already ruined. In considering the state my own home had been in when I bought it, it wouldn't have come as any surprise to me if someone was out there now for the express purpose of looting the vacant, unsold houses. The stranger, however, did nothing out of the ordinary and would have been completely unremarkable if it weren't for the fact it was after 3 a.m. and that he was alone and on my street. Slowly shuffling, the shadowy figure made his way through the neighborhood, passing a little too close, I thought, to the front of my house before merging with the night and disappearing from my line of sight again. Maybe I was making too much out of it, I thought. Perhaps it was just some old eccentric, every town's got one, or some drunk rambling around after downing a bottle or two. But my concerns began to grow when the exact same thing happened during my paralysis the next night. After an uneventful day during which I tried to relax and set work aside in order to regain some stability, I woke up this time at exactly 3:22 a.m. I watched the same figure again pass my house before vanishing into the darkness. He, I found myself assuming that it was a he, had to be up to something. I couldn't see his face in the shadows of the streetlights, obscured as it was by what appeared to be a wide-brimmed hat. I tried to remember if any of my neighbors had a limp leg, but no one came to mind. I wasn't surprised, though, and reasoned that I had yet to meet everyone who lived on my street. Much of the population had made themselves scarce, and for all I knew, someone could have fallen and hurt himself in the weeks since the initial flurry of welcome to the neighborhood visits. The day and night that followed went smoothly, without anything worthy of mention. I did ask around, though, as inconspicuously as possible, to see whether anyone knew of someone who resembled the man I saw during the late-night crisis. No one had any clue who or what I was talking about. By the end of the day, I feared my neighbors had me pegged as an unhinged lunatic. That night was when I started to notice the stuff that didn't fit with the "it's just a limping neighbor" theory. As I'd expected, the man returned at his usual hour, went on his usual walk, and took his usual path. Exactly the same path. I mean, literally. He stopped to catch his breath near the third house down the road, cocked his head slightly as he crossed the empty asphalt, and then tripped, nearly falling over when he got to the intersection. It was impossible, but I swear that if I had counted his steps, I would have found that he took the exact same number of them every night. As soon as he disappeared, I gasped in shock and brought my hand to my mouth. The sleep paralysis was gone. I got up and went straight to the window, lifting the sash and sticking my head out to see if I could catch a glimpse of the shadow skulking away. Nothing. He had disappeared, and along with him, the invisible force which had held me down. Suffice it to say, I was both intrigued and disturbed by what had happened and was quite certain it hadn't been a nightmare. Sleep was now out of the question. I contemplated calling a friend of mine, a self-professed expert in all things paranormal, but realized it was far too late in the day. As a result, I had just one option left. I jumped online and posted my experience on various paranormal boards, hoping my story would remain visible amidst the countless phony ghost pictures that flooded the forums. My post got a better response than I had expected. There were the typical trolls who joked about it being Blair Witch 3, but maybe that was why one user suggested to me that I should videotape the evidence and post it to be reviewed by other posters. I didn't know what else to do, so I obliged, and the following night my camera was set up, facing towards the street. I started the tape recording at midnight on the dot. Sure enough, the stranger showed up again, and I swear went through exactly the same motions again. When it was over and I was able to get up, still a bit heavy on my legs but surprisingly recovered, the first thing I did was grab the camera to transfer the video, hoping to be able to zoom in on the figure and finally see who or what it was. You can imagine my shock when the stranger was nowhere to be seen. I fast-forwarded through the whole thing and he simply didn't appear on the video. Nearly 5 hours of footage of an empty street. That's what I watched. Baffled, I tried to explain my situation on the website and was met with general mockery. However, some of the members insisted I upload the file so they could search it themselves. For anomalies, they said. The results they posted later that evening were bizarre. It seemed that the man had indeed been caught by my camera, but only in a single frame. Somewhere around 3 hours, 22 minutes, and 50 seconds, a human-shaped shadow appeared near one of the streetlights, only to be gone in the next frame. Unnerved, I searched my own video to see if they were ribbing me. No. There it was, exactly 3:22:51. The same blurry silhouette. What I did next, well, why it seemed like a good idea at the time, I'll never know. I guess it was because I was tired and angry at having my nights constantly interrupted. It was now clear this was no normal human being. Despite the warnings of the 2 or 3 geeks on the other side of the computer screen that made it sound so easy to deal with, suggesting that it would be better to just wait until the phenomenon subsided or simply move to another home, I decided to stay awake, keep watch outside, and confront the thing. This is precisely what I've been doing for the last 2 hours. Sitting here between the weeds and the bugs and writing this down to document my experience. But mostly to keep me busy until it comes, since I don't expect to be disturbed until our usual appointment. September 23rd, 2011, 3:22 a.m. I really can't expect anyone to believe what just happened, but please, if you have listened this long, you might as well hear me out and at least take my advice and not follow my footsteps. I've messed up badly, and now I may be about to pay the ultimate price for my recklessness. This waking nightmare has this time bonded me not to my bed, but to the horrors I just witnessed. To this moment that may well be my last, but I've got to calm down. I have to calm down and try to explain the best way I can what led me to my current situation. Otherwise, all my efforts will have been in vain. As I said before, I was hiding on the side of my porch, waiting for the thing to make its move, checking my watch and fumbling with my dad's revolver. Now, I'm not the person who normally resorts to violence, and if I had my way, there would have been no firearms in my new house, but my father gave it to me and insisted I kept it, fearing for my safety while I was living alone in such an isolated area. I had just kept it in a box. Never once did it cross my mind that one day I would have to load it, much less use it. My plan was simple. Follow the thing, find out what it was, and scare it away with a few gunshots. In hindsight, the plan was as stupid as they come, but sleep deprivation, outright anger and frustration, coupled with the drinks I'd had in order to gain some courage, all conspired to make it seem a reasonable idea. I started to regret my decision, however, the moment it appeared. Down at the far end of the street, the increasingly familiar black silhouette crept its way out of the shadows, starting its walk along the only path it had ever taken. I checked my clock, and sure enough, it was 3:22:51. I didn't know then, and I can't believe it now. Never mind. I'm getting ahead of myself. The man, let's keep calling it that even if I'm still not sure, painstakingly crept past the first few houses on my block, pausing frequently in front of a wooded gate here or holding onto a lamppost there. I checked again. 3:22:51. Hunched as usual, it crossed the street at a snail's pace, head bobbing as if looking around for cars that were nowhere to be seen. Coughing, the haggard figure stopped to hold onto a traffic light. I shivered when my watch reported back 3:22:51. Down the road and a turn to the right in slow, heavy steps he shambled. I refused to believe it was still 3:22:51. All the bravado I had gathered from the day, internet, and bottle drained away, and I found myself skittering back to the front door, desperately trying to force it open so that I could retreat inside and hide in my room. But the knob wouldn't budge. It was as though it had turned to stone. No matter how much strength I put into it, it remained in its original position as if paralyzed. The realization struck me like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just the doorknob. All around me, the usual autumn breezes were dead. Leaves were glued to the ground. Tree branches were as immobile as metal statues of themselves. In the sky, the moon shone steadily between the unmoving clouds, working together with the dim streetlights to cover the stranger in a sickly greenish glow. The form was still approaching and almost upon me. This close, I could see it more clearly. The dark, moth-eaten jacket and pants, the patches of gray, long, uneven hair crowning its features in shadow. But everything else about him seemed blurry, as if coated in a sticky layer of darkness. I edged behind a fence and watched in horror as he passed the front of my house. He seemed to be barefoot and heading towards the dirt road that led to the nearby woods. Even though I was as terrified as I had ever been, I couldn't help it. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed the stranger as he shambled down the last of our street before heading into the wilderness. Half afraid he'd stop me and half even more afraid I could be stuck in this, I don't know what to call it, time freeze? The space between seconds? The moment before you start to inhale? Whatever it was, the being was certainly related to the paralytic phenomenon I'd been experiencing. And now I was in this parallel zone with the creature, whether I wanted to be or not. Together we tiptoed past the empty houses, him leading the way without ever stopping, me pausing every once in a while to pat the reassuring weight of the revolver in my pocket. In this way, our two-man caravan abandoned civilization and plunged deep into the undergrowth. The hard, cold metal of the gun should have given me at least a small amount of confidence, but the truth is, I was scared shitless. Every time I'd feel a pebble under my shoe or a twig brush against my head, I'd hold my breath, praying that the thing I was following hadn't noticed. Sometimes it would stop, causing me to gag on a scream while I watched it stagger towards some nearby trunk to lean on for a moment, only to continue marching into the depths of the gnarled woods. That's when I noticed the silence. Following the being through the tangled and wiry bushes that littered the pathway should have made some noise. Instead, not a single leaf rustled, nor did the undergrowth crumple. While I had every reason to be extra cautious, my quarry didn't seem to bother at all and simply plowed through the foliage like a fog creeping in. He was silent too, and it wasn't just him. No, the wretched thing seemed to have contaminated the world all around us. No cricket, mosquito, or owl dared to break the stillness that froze the air, and I couldn't help but wonder if they were all paralyzed in their nests and burrows as I had been in my bed. A rank, putrid stench began to set in as we approached what I suspected to be the nearby swamp. I used to be able to hear the toads as I sat on my balcony during the calm summer nights. There was no croaking this time, but my suspicions as to our location were nevertheless confirmed. Beams of pale green light gleamed on the pools of muddy water, a dark mirror of browns and blacks that might as well have been made of dirty glass. The silence was deathly. No ripple, no frog, no gas bubble disturbed by the water's surface as the stranger stopped and sat at the muddy edge of a pool, almost as if contemplating the sight. His bare feet slumped into the mushy paste of the earth and dried algae without the slightest noise. Under the moonlight, I thought I would be able to see beneath all those baggy and rotten clothes if I snuck just a bit closer. Slowly, I approached the being from behind, half expecting to see toad-like hands and gills carved into its neck, like something out of H.P. Lovecraft tales I used to read in my freshman year. The truth was far simpler and more disturbing than that. I watched as it pulled one of its feet from the muck and water, and with it came the 3 remaining black and withered toes, the cracked, parchment-like skin peeking out from the muddy residue. I let out a gasp and staggered away in shock, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that carcass of a man that I had watched walking down my street night after night. As I stared, unable to take my eyes from it, the rotten monstrosity turned its head to face me. It looked at me with one eye hanging from its socket, its bloated face obscured by its matted hair. Its mouth opened and it gurgled at me, as though commanding my ears to hear his voice. Open wounds and exposed skull now visible and glistening at me under the moonlight sent the contents of my stomach back to my throat and filled my mouth with searing acid. Without a second glance, I darted off to the woods, spitting vomit as I ran and silently swearing as I slammed blindly against trunks and branches. The sharp iron-like limbs and leaves scraped against my face, and I ducked my head to keep my eyes safe until I bumped into something heavy and wet and was knocked to the ground. Scrambling, I tried to scurry away from whatever I'd just run into, but my leg got caught on something and I panicked. It only took a moment to see the situation for what it really was. I wasn't caught. My leg was being pinned to the ground. I dropped the gun twice before finally being able to retrieve it and point it at whatever was holding me down. On the other side of my barrel's sight, I met the yellowish gaze of a woman hanging from a nearby tree, staring at me with bulging eyes covered by the same layer of pus and blood that enveloped the rest of her twitching body. A body just long enough for her feet to hold my legs down. All around in the depths of the small forest, I could see now that other things also crawled around. Things far too thin and ragged to be alive. The air was filled with the pungent stench of death. I had to get out of there. Gritting my teeth and rolling away from the thrashing legs of the corpse hanging over me, I held my gun close and rushed towards a dim yellow light I could barely see shining in the distance, ignoring the skinless fingers that dug through the undergrowth and the dripping entrails of another disturbing silhouette impaled on one of the higher branches. I emerged from the woods and found myself in an unfamiliar section of my suburb. The streetlights brought yet more horrors, and I had to force myself to keep running. I darted past a man inside the metal cage of what had once been a totaled vehicle, as he desperately tried to claw his way out of his final resting place. He banged on invisible glass and a non-existent metal frame while yelling to me to save him from the flames, throwing himself repeatedly against barriers that were no longer there. Though I tried, I could not avoid looking at his face, and ran off, likewise pretending to ignore the jumbled mass of broken bones and leftover limbs twisted into impossible angles that inched sickeningly across the sidewalk. Others kept to the shadows, skulking on street corners or behind the veil of dark doorways, just far enough to be out of sight, but close enough for me to hear the slowly increasing sound of footsteps all around me. I kept going, but to where was I running? Returning home was the first thing that came to my mind, but now I could see just how stupid the idea was. Even if I got there, what use would that be if the doors were still frozen? Until the paralysis caused by the apparent rift in space and time, if that was what it was, let up. There was no reason to try to find shelter indoors, since I wouldn't be able to close the doors again on this unholy mass. Unless the church. I was never a superstitious man, but then I hadn't met any walking corpses before, and from some of the tales I'd read, I remembered that the living dead couldn't walk on holy ground, and that would include everything within the high iron fences surrounding the little parish church, right? Anyway, it was better than doing nothing. At the very least, I could buy myself some time to plan my next step. Shadows shuffled in my peripheral vision as I made it across the second intersection, stopping to take a glance inside one of the few cars parked outdoors in the irrational hope that owners could have left the key inside and that I could open the door and start it, but the glass only reflected a vision of hell. Looming behind me were dozens of rotting heads staring with unblinking eyes, their mouths agape. Without turning back, I jolted left, only to come face to face with a man in a blood-smeared jacket who looked at me with an almost childlike expression on his ruined face. Without a single thought, I jumped on top of the vehicle, grateful that the windshield held, and cursed myself for having wasted my time. I would have never been able to break in anyway. Leaping off the car's hood and racing towards the final intersection that stood between me and sanctuary, my heart pounded in my chest as the ghostly crowd took up the chase, the thumping of their feet ever closer, following my own inaudible footsteps. As I turned right, despair overwhelmed me. The far end of the road just before the church vomited a new crawling mass at me, effectively cutting off my best route. With the first horde still hot on my heels, I had no choice but to continue forward, towards the shambling army that awaited me. Or so they hoped. A front yard came into view, which, like the churchyard, was circled by an iron fence topped with spikes. I didn't hesitate to try and climb it. Corpses weren't known for their agility, but unfortunately, neither was I, and I managed only to fall flat on the ground when my grip slipped. Before I could get up, a horrible pain shot through my legs, as if icicles had punctured them, and before I could kick away, more ice-cold vices gripped my right arm. Rolling my head to see what had me trapped, I witnessed the moving face of a woman, with no lips nor gums left in her jaws, whispering at me. She dug her cold, wet fingers into my neck. I tried to punch and kick, but could barely move as more and more bony arms pinned my legs and body to the concrete. I still had one hand free and used it to do what any sane man would have done long ago. I raised my gun. Instantly, some of my assailants backed away, one of them clutching the dry and visible holes in his chest as he did so. And I seized the moment to kick myself free of the last of them and unload the revolver, hoping at least the noise and light would scare them away. The gun spurted only dead air as I felt it ineffectively click through all 6 of its loaded chambers. I dropped the useless piece of metal as I flung myself again at the fence, this time managing to get to the top unharmed, while the ragged crowd recovered from its confusion and their low gurgles gave way to snarls as they came at me again. Dropping down into the safety of the protected yard, I ran as fast as I could around the side of the backyard and dashed over a much smaller wooded fence just in time to hear my pursuers starting to spill over the porch. Though I was exhausted like I'd never been before, my inner strength was relit by hope. I could see the light of the church. I headed straight for the hill and got back on the main road, ignoring the constant ache of my legs where the icy claws had dug into flesh. The church rose on the horizon and I took one last glimpse back to see the undead horde still struggling to free themselves from the obstacle which I'd led them. Many were stuck, half in and half out of the iron fence, with a few stuck up on the upper spikes and no way to catch up to me now. This was it. I knew I could make it. The church was just ahead now, and I could see the lights were on inside. And there were people there, others who had taken shelter beyond the churchyard fence, in the light of the sanctuary. I was right, and now everything was going to be okay. I pressed on, telling myself the way the parishioners leaned as they walked was probably because they were as tired as I, caught in the dead of night by this invasion from beyond. I ran, even while trying to convince myself that the gruesome injuries I started to see even from this distance were sustained in their own fights to get into the church. I forced my legs to keep moving while weakly holding out hope that I wasn't alone and had finally found help. But when the headstones of the churchyard cemetery came into view beyond the fence, and with them the scrawny, wraith-like shadows that scurried amongst the tombs, I realized I couldn't keep lying to myself. I hide now in this hollow, having run what I hope to be enough of a distance to put me out of their range, and wonder how long it will take until these things depart, if they ever depart. In the now distant town, the ghouls continue to come and go, occasionally sticking their heads up or sniffing the air. It has been 3 hours, 22 minutes, and 51 seconds for a long while now, just as it was when I began to write my story. I need to get the word out, where even though it may not be believed, it will at least be heard and serve as a warning. There are things that go bump in the night, and there is a real risk of venturing too deep into the abyss to be able to return to life. If you wake up paralyzed in the middle of the night, consider perhaps that there is a very good reason why you are unable to move. Just, please, never ever try to leave the bed.
Dear Mommy, how are you? I am fine. I am learning to record my stuff using the computer. I wish you could be here. It is scary. They will not let me have Mr. Buttons. Please, Mommy, will you bring him to me? He comes in my dreams all the time now. He needs me. When do I get to go home? I do not like it here. The nurse is bad. She said that I lie. I do not, Mommy. Dr. Bob says that I lie. Why do they say I lie about Aunt Audrey? I promise you that I told the truth. I really did see her make Grandma sick. Mr. Button saw it too. She went and got Grandma's money out of her special box under Grandpa's bed. Grandma let me and Mr. Button see it one time. She told me never to tell anyone, ever, and I did not. That is the money that Aunt Audrey took. She took it away and put it down in the cellar. Then she put the cheese out of the box under the sink in Grandma's food. I saw Mr. Buttons tell her how to do it, Mommy. Why don't they believe me? I even told the policeman when Aunt Audrey said not to tell anyone or she would make me hurt. She said she would kill you and make you go to sleep like she did Grandma and Daddy. Did she make Daddy go to heaven, Mommy? Did she feed him soup too? I think she did. Did Daddy have a life savings box too? That is what Graham called her special box. She told me that Gramps did not like banks. Gramps took his dollars and put them all in his special box. He let me look at them one time, but he said I could not tell. But I told Mr. Buttons. Grandma said that she was going to give you the box before she went to heaven. Aunt Audrey heard her tell me and she got mad. Grandma did not know Aunt Audrey heard her, but I saw her in the mirror. She looked at us funny, and then her face got red and she went away. When she came back for supper, she made Grandma soup and put the cheese for the rats in it. It was what makes the rats in the barn die. Grandma said so. Grandma said never to get it on my hands or I would be sick. Why did she want to make Grandma sick? I think she took the life savings box too. It is not under Grandpa's bed no more. But Mr. Buttons knows where it is. He told me so. He tells me lots of things, Mommy. Remember when you came to get me? Then remember Aunt Audrey hugged me and Mr. Buttons so hard it hurted? She told me not to tell you or you would get sick like Grandma did. She said you would go to heaven if I told. She said she knowed how to make you go. I did not want you to go to heaven, Mommy. I want you to stay here with me. The lady has come and told me I have to go to bed. I made her pinky promise that she will give you my letter. She said that I can make another message on the computer tomorrow after I go and take a shocker test. She said that you told her it'd be okay. Did you say it was okay? She said that after I take the shocker test, that I can have all the candy I want. Can I, Mommy? Will you come and see me sometime? I do not like it here. Mary cries all the time. She's in the next room. I hear her cry. The bad lady in the white dress says it's because she tells lies. I do not think that is true. Mary draws pictures on her walls. They're all red. I wish I got red paint too. I miss you, Mommy. Come and get me, okay? I will not tell anyone about the cheese under the sink. You have some of it too, Mommy. It is the one with the X on it. Mr. Buttons knows which one it is. I sneaked and looked when he showed Aunt Audrey. The lady says I have to go to bed now. I love you very much. I'll record you a message after the shocker test tomorrow. Please write back to me, okay? I love you. I love you with all of me. Your little angel, Tabitha Martin. P.S. Do you still call me that? I hope that you do. XOXOXOXOXO. That is lots of hugs and kissing for you. Please come and get me like you said, okay? I want to come home. I have to go now for real this time. If you see Aunt Audrey, tell her that I will not say where she put the box. If you'll just come and get me, okay? I know where she put it. Mr. Buttons told me. He tells me lots of things. I heard Aunt Audrey talk on the phone to her boyfriend. He hits Aunt Audrey. I saw. He wants the life-saving box, too. I heard him yell at Aunt Audrey one day when she used your phone. But she did not tell him. Then she went down in her basement and got the box and dug a hole out in the shed. Mr. Button saw her, Mommy. I promise. You could go get the box, Mommy. It is yours. Grandma said. Well, I have to go. The lady says I have to go now for real, or she's gonna give me a shot. I love you, Mommy. 1,000,000 times very much. Bye. Signed, Tabby. P.S.S. Please go check on Mr. Buttons. He needs me, Mommy. He needs me to become...
Mr. Pop...
You're going to bankrupt me. Is that your goal here?
Richard, relax.
Whose side are you on anyway?
Richard, don't worry about that. We'll work something out. They don't have a leg to stand on. It's just a matter of letting due process take its course.
Then what? I sell the land to pay your legal fees and I've achieved nothing? Kind of defeats the purpose.
Hang in there, man. Things will come around before you know it.
Yeah, well, I'd feel better if I could at least get these nut jobs off my land.
Patience, Richard. Don't push these guys. You have the law on your side, but they'll sue at the drop of a hat. Don't give them an excuse. They're not hurting anything.
Except my peace of mind. Oh, and they might just bring about the end of the world.
Oh, come on, Rich. Let it go. When this is over, we'll leave enough boot prints on their asses that they'll be looking forward to the apocalypse.
They already are. That's the problem. Look, I gotta go. I can't afford to keep talking.
I'm not charging for this, Richard. Just an update.
Well, thanks for that, but I mean my phone bill. I'll be in touch.
Bye, Richard. Hang in there.
The phone clicked off. Richard sat listening for a dial tone, then realized that he hadn't heard a dial tone in years. Longing for better days, he mused, looking at his cell phone. The blinking time indicator said 23 minutes. He'd been talking for 23 minutes and hadn't learned anything new. Stupid lawyers and stupid technology. That phone call was going to cost him. Anytime minutes don't exist when you're as far outside of the network as Richard's ranch. The phone had to relay off of military towers to reach the corporate grid. He didn't know if it cost the phone company anything, but they sure enjoyed charging him for it. Richard looked out the picture window and across his front acreage. He could see the tree with the white van parked under it. They had built a small fire, a cautious distance from the tree, of course, and were huddled around it despite the heat. At 200 yards, it was hard to make out what they were doing, and the heat-distorted air between them made whatever it was look as unsettling as it was annoying. They looked like they were acting out a play, except the mirage made them warble like those floppy-armed tube creatures in front of car dealerships. Richard tried to look away and go about his business, but he kept seeing them from the corner of his eye, stark white clothes standing out against the pale desert background. This wasn't retirement. This wasn't isolation. How come all the crazies in the world always found a way to ruin everything? Richard forced his eyes away from the window and cursed at the cultists who invaded his golden years. Then he threw in a few choice words for the olive tree as well. He wasn't the type for cursing, but he'd been doing it a lot lately. A bowl of dirty-looking gray fruit, ostensibly olives, but not really, loomed on the counter in front of him. He cursed and looked away from those too. Dust kept up around his boots as he stormed toward the tool shed. He didn't squint in the sun anymore. He'd grown used to the glare. But he kept a hand over his brow to preserve at least a little dark vision to check the shed for rattlesnakes. He felt a length of uncombed hair brush the top of his fingers. It was bristly and thin, sun-bleached in a way that turned his tired gray into a manly, or at least folksy, silver. Life had come back to him since he had moved 30 miles from nowhere. Emphasis on had. He felt age creeping up on him again in the last couple weeks. Quiet and honest, a perfect retirement, he grumbled. No rattlesnakes. Richard tried to feel happy about that, but he secretly kind of wanted to beat one with a shovel just to make himself feel better. It wouldn't have, though, and he knew it. Cutting down the tree, on the other hand, might. He pulled the single-horsepower chainsaw off the wall. The 14-inch chain, which seemed like more than enough to cut away dogwood and sagebrush, seemed pitifully small against the girth of the olive tree, but it would do. The distant rumbling sound of an engine floated into the shed, carried on the dry breeze. Richard stepped back outside to see the twin plumes of dirt billowing from behind the tires of a city driver going too fast on the incoming dirt road. He smiled and put the chainsaw back on its peg. Even better, he thought. The professor arrived first, but the deputy was only a short ways behind. Then Whitney Whittle, the face of Evening 5 News, arrived, looking as worn out as Richard.
"Can I talk to you when we get a second?"
Whitney asked him in a whisper. Richard nodded briefly, and Whitney seemed to rejuvenate a little. "So, who have we here?" A middle-aged man with an Atlanta Hawks ball cap, ringed with sweat and collecting dust, bowed over so slightly and wiped a sweaty palm on his khakis. "Dr. Adnan Beljovic, University of Georgia, Athens," said the professor, shaking the smiling anchorwoman's hand. "Dr. Beljovic is a premier dendrologist," Richard said. "Flew in just for this." "You don't say," Whitney smiled. "Well, I'm not surprised. This special little tree of ours is gaining national attention. That's part of what I wanted to talk to you about, Richard. Today America called and wanted to send a correspondent. I told them we'll see how today goes, but this scoop is mine, so they'd better get in line." She smiled again, but it was terse. She knew that today could go anyway, good, bad, or terrifying. "How sporting of you," Richard said. "I can't believe you still want this story, though, after... Oh, now more than ever," she replied. The professor began untying a gray box full of gear from the roof of the Jeep while the deputy looked around suspiciously. His eyes kept resting on the tree and the van in the distant heat. He chewed on a toothpick and sighed a lot. Richard sighed too, looking at the ground and all the footprints in what was supposed to be his frontier getaway. He had a feeling that his retirement was going to get even less quiet very soon. In a way, he wanted Today America to show up. He wanted to talk to someone nationally. He wanted to grab them by the ears and ask them why they cared. Who told them to give a damn? Why, of all the campfire stories in the world, did they have to be concerned about this one? He wanted to see their eyes when they realized that they didn't have an answer to that. He wanted to hear them try to rationalize about how some things just catch the national interest or how people love a mystery. He wanted to hear them explain away how this tree had the uncanny ability to draw people to it and to what? "You okay?" Whitney's voice filtered through Richard's frustration. "Yeah," he managed, unclenching his fist. "For a moment there, I almost had something." The anchorwoman looked at him with a twitch. "I know the feeling," she said. "Have you remembered anything at all yet?" "No." This time, Whitney sighed. "I wonder what it wants," she whispered. "Nothing. It wants nothing. It's a damn tree." The deputy went first. Father Absalom stood with his hands clasped behind his back and a friendly smile on his face. Smoke from the fire was still trickling into the sky. The deputy didn't ask to see his hands, but tactfully waved from a distance, eliciting a wave back from the smarmy cult leader. His hands were empty. Richard wouldn't have been surprised either way. "Hold up, deputy," Richard said. The deputy looked back. "A few minutes ago, there were more of them." The deputy tensed, clearly resisting the urge to look around. "How many?" he asked. "I don't know. Half a dozen or so." "Okay. Stay here," he ordered. Richard didn't need telling. They'd gotten close enough to the tree when they drove the police jeep up to the cultists' camp. what Richard called the squatter's village. Richard didn't like having to drive over his land. He'd not even bought any cattle for his supposed ranch, not wanting to despoil the desert landscape that most people called ugly and wasteland to begin with. The tracks from the stupid white van the cultists had driven in there were still visible from 2 weeks earlier. This was slow country, hard to hunt but long to heal. "Morning," the deputy called out. "Well met, deputy," and the cult leader smiled. "Father Absalom," Richard whispered to the professor several yards away. "Head of the cult that worships the tree. Don't let the stupid name fool you. He's got money and connections." "A real Jim Jones character," Whitney editorialized from behind them. "He's put a claim on the land and somehow gotten a judge to go along with it." "You don't say," the professor said. "Yeah," Richard groused. "On my own land. Some lawyer found an issue with the original land grant 130 years ago and claims it was never officially made available for homestead. It's BS. My lawyers say it'll never stand up, but it's still got to go through the process. Something tells me this cult is just buying time." "For what?" the professor asked. "I haven't figured that out yet. Maybe you can." "I don't see how." The deputy's hand hovered near his pistol. The unaccounted for cultists had made him nervous. a.k.a. County hadn't seen an Old West shootout for half a century or more. In the Mayberry towns he patrolled didn't finance training for these situations. If they were up to something, he'd be a sitting duck. In his other hand was a folded sheet of paper, a court-mandated order for a dendrochronological study of the ancient-looking olive tree on Richard's land. The age of the tree would indicate when the land had officially been brought into productivity, a vital component for all homestead cases. A smile, like rigor mortis, stayed frozen on Father Absalom's face, friendliness betrayed by the belying squint of his eyes. Aside from dirty politics, the deputy had no reason to suspect anything nefarious from the group of weirdos, but for some reason he did anyway. "I suppose you know why we're here?" the deputy asked. "Yes, sir. We know all about the study," Father Absalom beamed. "Are we going to have any problems?" "No, sir. In fact, I welcome it. It will confirm what I've been saying. This tree isn't part of the original plantation and therefore proves that this land is sacred." The deputy glanced around at the miles of beige grass and pale sage, finding it hard to believe that this land could be suitable for growing anything, much less sacred. "It's because of the river," Father Absalom said, perhaps sensing the deputy's thoughts. "Behind you." "I know where the river is," the deputy assured, not turning away. "Then you know that it's very important." "Most rivers are. Look, Father, is it? I'm not here to make judgments. If we can get on with this, we'll be out of your hair." "Is that an insult?" Father Absalom joked, his smile looking slightly more genuine as he rubbed his shaven head, glowing red with too much sun. The deputy chuckled in spite of himself. The loony sure had charm, he had to give him that. "No, sorry, just an expression," the deputy said. "So, tell me, you don't really think this thing is some sort of god?" "Yes, I do. I know it's hard to believe, Deputy. Petty. Deputy Petty. But with a little faith, it's not much stranger than your own beliefs. After all, a cracker that literally becomes flesh upon a prayer. Pretty far stretch." "Yeah, but," Deputy Petty began, but then stopped. How had the father known that? Transubstantiation and its literalness was a huge debate amongst Baptists, and as far as Petty knew, he was one of only a few in the area who believed in it. To tell the truth, he hadn't thought much about it for a long time. You keep saying I, the deputy changed the subject. The landowner says there were more of you around. Where are they at, Mr. Absalom? In the van. We don't want to be an imposition. Uh-huh, the deputy said. Just so long as no one tries to stop the tests. Oh, no one will, Father Absalom said. But it's not someone you have to worry about. It's whether the tree will let you take the sample that may be at issue. Someone's going to bleed, Whitney said to Richard. Yeah, it's like the life, Richard replied. They whispered despite being alone a dozen yards from the tree. The anchorwoman had set up a camera and left it running, so she'd do the voiceover later. She looked at Richard. How did we know that? I don't know, I think, Richard began, but a quick yelp caused him to tense. Dr. Beljovic startled and stood up. It's okay. He called from the next to the tree, where he was unpacking his gray box. These corners are sharp, he said with an embarrassed chuckle. He stuck a red finger in his mouth. Well, there's that, Richard whispered. Whitney said nothing, just frowned and turned sallow. The sun beat down hotter as it headed toward the western horizon. The sun takes a long time to set in the open expanse of high desert. Richard awaited it eagerly. Long ago, he found that the sun made it worse, the tree. Most things that kept him awake at night seemed to be lurking in the dark, but this tree... Trees love the light. It's when they're most alive. They sleep at night, just like people. Well, most people. 2 weeks earlier, he had awoke from the last good night of sleep he could remember. There was a light fog outside his new high-desert home. The term home was modest. 40 years of investing and 60 years of being mostly single had allowed him to save enough money for something similar to a mansion. He'd been surprised to find one seated halfway up a juniper and granite-covered hillside on the uninhabited face of a small Owyhee mountain range. As far as mountains went, the Owyhees were modest for the west, but the views of the small glacier-carved valleys at sunset were all Richard needed to be sold. He probably wouldn't have bought such an opulent house if it weren't already there. He had no idea who owned it prior, nor why they left, but it looked relatively new. He'd only been there for 3 weeks before that morning, but he'd already begun to learn the land, the animals, the weather. He knew that he could expect some powerful storm clouds to grow up against the wall of heat that the mountains lifted from the flat expanse into the sky. He knew exactly the ridge to go sit on and watch it happen, and which way the clouds would break free when they accumulated enough energy to knock down the wall of heat and go storming toward the big cities to the north. From his ridge, he'd be able to watch them hit the distant mountain range beyond those cities and dump all of his... Yes, he thought of anything that came from this land as his now. Rain in torrents upon the state capital. He thought of people clamoring to get inside, hiding under eaves and umbrellas, cowering in their homes, and frantically making hot cocoa to try and get the most out of the late spring cloudburst. The thought was a pleasant one, as long as it stayed far across the valley. He looked forward to the evening, but now he had to get working, preparing for the herd he assumed himself he was going to buy and raise. He was working on a horse stable to start with. Life was quiet and good. The mountains, the desert, the sunsets, they were a stage setting, barely animate, predictable, unwelcome. Until, of course, he left his house and kicked his way through the mist about 200 yards down to where a tree stood. He'd been made aware of the tree by the real estate agent. She said that it was planted by the original wagon train settlers. She seemed to think it was a selling point, especially after gleefully exhibiting the old illegible names and dates carved into the bark. It looked old enough to fit the bill, gnarled and rough, but was honestly pretty unimpressive to Richard. Barely 5 feet high, it had more dead branches than live, and the few living ones only had 2 wrinkled little gray fruits hanging from them. Richard acted impressed all the same. "The fruits are edible," the realtor said. "That's not why they planted it, the settlers. I guess they were used as windbreaks and to distract birds from eating the crops. But I hear you can make jelly if you want." "What did they grow here?" Richard asked with the same cynicism that Deputy Petty would display a month later. "I don't know," the realtor said. "Probably nothing. That trench there, with a trickle of water, was the old irrigation ditch, but it didn't really get used." She hedged then, sizing up Richard for a second. Looking indecisive, she said, "Do you like ghost stories?" That misty morning, 3 weeks later, when Richard saw the tree appear out of the fog, he decidedly concluded that he did not in fact like ghost stories. He ran, called the police, and locked the doors. By the time anyone arrived, Richard had gone through the entire ghost story in his mind several times, short as it was. Russian olives weren't supposed to live very long, but this one had. Somewhere along the line, someone had realized that and come up with a stupid little story for Boy Scouts to tell around campfires. There wasn't much for local kids from the 3-horse towns nearby to talk about, so they kept up the story, evolving it, and making it bigger. Beyond local folklore, though, there was no reason to care about a stupid old haunted tree, whether it was used as an Old West hanging tree or not. And there was no reason to fear the ghosts of the probably make-believe hanged outlaws who died there. Or so Richard thought. But they were on that morning. 3 dead bodies, canvas-bagged heads, hanging from a fully bloomed Russian olive tree in the early morning mist. The ghosts of 3 Old West outlaws had come back for revenge from beyond the grave. Richard had watched them from the big window as he waited for the police to arrive. To his surprise, the first car to come flying up the dirt road wasn't a police car. It was a big white van with a retracted broadcast antenna on top and a big blue 5 on the side. I guess that's a start, Richard thought. At first he didn't like the idea of having the media running around on his land, but anxiety soon overcame his dislike of civilization, and he was just happy to have anyone nearby. After finding 3 corpses mysteriously hanging from an overgrown ghost tree, a lifetime of grumpiness is a small thing to set aside. Moments later, though, he was disappointed to find that the only person inside the van was a diminutive bleach blonde with a hasty makeup and a blazer over a pair of sweatpants. It may have been sexist, but Richard had at least wanted a burly cameraman with tattoos and a backwards cap to step out next. Unfortunately, the local news station didn't have the kind of money for cameramen and anchorwomen. It was a one-person gig. "Hey, grab that case," the anchorwoman demanded as she unloaded a heavy-looking camera and started uncoiling wires. "Whitney Whittle," she introduced herself as Richard complied. "You call in the hangings?" "I did. I own this land. How'd you get here so fast?" "Coming out of Grandview, and I heard the scanner. You are Richard. Good to meet you. So, what are you thinking? Murder? Suicide? Is it racism? Hangings, you know. We've had the Aryan nations in this state, you know." She spoke quickly, like the city people Richard had come here to avoid. "Yeah, I know," he said, "and I'm not in a position to speculate. Well, let's get to it before we lose this lighting. I love the fog. How many did you say there were?" Richard tensed, not knowing whether he should be talking about this or not. He'd never been at a crime scene before. He figured it couldn't hurt. What did he have to hide? 3, though I can't tell the race. I think it might have something to do with this story I heard. Ghost story. "Whoa, stop talking." Whitney smiled. "I gotta get this on camera." Richard sighed and flushed. Was he seriously going to tell all this to a news reporter? Hell no, he wasn't. "Just come with me. Bring that," he said, pointing to the camera. Briskly, he started walking across the misty field. The fog had lessened to ground cover as the long shadows shortened with the rising sun. Almost immediately, the three bodies could be seen hanging from the tree in the distance. Richard had to admit the lighting and the mist did make for a very striking scene. Whitney oohed and started rolling the camera. "Sure you don't want to wait for the police?" Richard asked. "Oh, I'm sure. They'll have this place locked down tight. Besides, whoever did this is probably long gone, unless it was you." She glanced furtively at Richard. He rolled his eyes. "Hey, I called the police, remember?" he said. "I'm not a counting criminal, but I'd know better than that." "Well, I'm packing, just for the record," she replied, patting a purse slung around his shoulder. Richard rolled his eyes again. Like a cat stalking its prey, the pair approached the tree. Richard was leading, trying to follow his previous tracks as much as possible to avoid disturbing any evidence. He'd watched some television, after all. Whitney continued to film. She dragged the power cables as far as it would go, then disconnected and went on batteries alone. She panted and stumbled under the weight, but held the camera rigid still with every step. The three bodies swayed listlessly in the morning breeze, their hands tied behind their backs. They each wore plain, rough-woven clothes from some natural fiber, and had canvas bags tied over their feet just like over their heads. Odd angles jutted out beneath the clothing and canvas, as though they each had several broken bones. That part wasn't in the ghost stories. "So you claim this tree just grew up overnight?" Whitney asked. A silent reverence that Richard didn't realize he was feeling fell away like a church sermon being interrupted by a fart. "No," he said, rather more harshly than he intended. "The tree's been here for years. It just grew bigger. There are more leaves, and it's taller." "Overnight?" Whitney repeated. "Yeah, I guess. You don't seem sure. What can you tell me about the story of the hanged outlaws?" Richard cleared his throat. "That's pretty much it. Bad guys robbed wagon trains, got hung, came back for vengeance every few years, or on Halloween, or on full moons, depending on who you ask. Ridiculous. And yet," Whitney gestured to the tree. "Hey, you know what? Maybe we should just wait for the police." And that was the last thing Richard remembered saying. He felt a sudden rush of energy starting at his feet, like he was soaking up caffeine by standing in a pool of it. When it reached his head, he was overwhelmed by 100 strange emotions at once. He simultaneously wanted to run in terror from the grisly scene before him and jump up to hug one of the corpses. He looked over to the anchorwoman who was staring back at him. Her hands shook. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Then his mind swirled into a defensive amnesia, trying to force order into a disintegrating reality. There was the faint memory of Whitney yelping in surprise, and a nightmarish illusion of the body on the far left suddenly jolting and writhing in its bonds. Several loud popping sounds echoed. The memory of being a teenager and finding his dad's stash of dirty magazines played through his mind. These things were only flashes in the periphery of his consciousness, figments, waking dreams intermingled with nothingness. The next thing he remembered was the flicker of blue and red lights and the murmur of voices approaching. He gasped for air as though he had just come up from a deep dive. He was standing where he had been before the blackout, unmoved. Whitney was still there too, but her camera was on the ground, and she held a small .32 automatic pistol in her hand. Streaks of makeup ran from her eyes like she'd been crying, though she didn't seem to be then. The slide of the pistol was locked back, the chamber empty. Richard looked down at the glinting brass all around her feet. Saying nothing, she followed his eyes, clearly surprised to be holding the gun. Richard never felt so alive. As the sound of voices grew with the approach of the police, barking dogs in tow, Whitney suddenly dropped down and started collecting the empty brass. "What the hell?" she muttered, stopping to feel around in her pockets. She gave Richard a derisive, hateful look, tinged with confusion and went back to collecting the shells. They can't find these. Richard nodded to nobody. He looked down and saw dried blood in his fingers. He traced its path to a subtle sting on his palm. He stuck his hand in his pocket to hide it. He didn't know why. Maybe something from the memory of those crime shows on TV warned him about leaving DNA, he reasoned. When the police arrived, they were too distracted by the 3 noosed corpses to catch either his or the reporter's odd behavior. Whitney stuffed the shells into the pocket of her sweats, picked up the camera, and silently started filming. "They're completely made of sticks," a laconic detective said to Richard. They were back by the Evening 5 news van, Richard having received a scolding for possibly tampering with a crime scene. News anchors were not investigators, he was told, no matter how much they think they are. He'd agreed and apologized, but heard little else the police said until the detective told him about the sticks. "What's that now?" Richard replied. "The corpses. They're not real. I think you've been pranked. They're mannequins made from someone's yard clippings. Very convincing, though. I don't blame you for being alarmed." "Honestly?" Richard said. "We found these." The detective held up a plastic evidence bag with bunched-up white cloth inside. Richard looked closer. It was a pair of women's underwear. Not the sexy kind, but sensible, well-worn panties. Richard squinted and looked at the detective. "Probably some country girl looking to kick the religious habit," the detective said. "We could run forensics on them," he said. "But this isn't the kind of thing the county would consider serious enough to finance. Basic trespassing, petty vandalism." He paused, looking dubious. "How far do we want to push this?" Richard waved his hand as if to rid himself of a fly. "Yeah, I hear you," he said. "We're wrapping up here. We'll hold the mannequins in evidence for a week, but I don't expect to find anything." "Fine. I'd suggest maybe getting some cameras installed." "Sure. Let us know if you need anything." "Will do. Thanks." Richard wasn't listening anymore. The cut on his hand was starting to hurt, and he wanted to get Bactine on it as soon as possible. First, though, he got up and walked to the back of the Evening 5 news van, where Whitney was supposedly running back the footage on the film. He peered into the dark interior, eyes slow to adjust, and knocked. "What did you do to me?" Richard recoiled as the anchor woman's tear-stained face jutted out of the darkness. Anger radiated from her, and Richard stepped back. "What?" he asked, hands up in defense. "Was this your plan? You roofied me. I'll have you jailed for this," she rasped, just low enough not to be heard by the police milling about. "What are you talking about? What's on the tape?" "It's not on tape, stupid. It's digital. And you know what I'm talking about, rapist." Whoa, Richard pleaded, leaning in. "I'm as confused as you are about what happened, but I know I didn't do that." Right. I didn't." "Trust me, you did," she yelled. Richard didn't ask for clarification. "And I'm getting DNA to prove it. Then you're finished." She was crying again. "You do that," Richard said, and stormed back to his house in confusion. The first phone call came from a Portland internet news company only 2 days later. They asked Richard if he had anything official to say about the tree. Richard didn't know what they were talking about and said so. He hadn't heard from Whitney Whittle since the incident in the van, and he was honestly starting to worry. The news company gave him an internet address and a phone number to call back. He threw the number in the trash. The internet address, however, took him to a video sharing website where his name featured prominently atop a banner next to the words, "Haunted Tree, can anyone explain this?" It had over 3 million views and was posted by someone named WW5. Richard hit play. The back of his head popped up on the screen, walking away from the camera, and towards a tree in the distance where 3 wooden corpses swayed in the breeze. The camera followed, Whitney Whittle's disembodied voice asking dumb questions about ghosts and outlaws. Richard turned, and they had the brief conversation that he remembered having only just a couple of days prior. But when he got to the sentence,
Maybe we should wait for
the audio stopped and the camera cut. Video came back, and it seemed that the camera had been placed on the ground, its view mostly obscured by sagebrush. The video cut, the camera view jostled, and the trunk of the tree clearly came into view. Richard watched in amazement as limbs and vines sprung from the trunk of the tree and grew like one of those nature documentaries with time-lapse. A Mormon cricket, ebony and sleek, trundled across the branch of the sagebrush, while the tree grew and twisted behind it. The video stopped, and white words, in all capitals, asked, "Real-life X-File? Any explanation?" Below the question, there was an email address. Richard scrolled down the page. Good CGI, but the frame rate jumps. Cuts give it away, calling hoax on this one. The first comment read, "Proof that evolution is a lie. He is in control of the world. Read your Bible, people," said the second. It had 342 replies. He clicked on them and then hit the back button when a block of text longer than most books popped up. The third comment said, "As a professional videographer, this looks pretty legit. Why all the cuts, though? Questions credibility." Richard rolled his eyes. Is this what passes for viral nowadays? Boring. Richard stopped reading and closed the browser, his mind drifting back to the tree the way it often did. The writhing vines and branches had sent a new wave of fear through him, like when he'd first seen the corpses. He knew exactly what that writhing looked like. It looked like how he felt moments before losing consciousness. A slow shiver crept up his spine. How can something look like a feeling? Suddenly, the desert heat felt too cold for comfort, the spacious house too big. He dug the phone number of the internet news company out of the trash can and stared at it. He crumpled it up and threw it back. He knew who had the answers.
Okay, fine, you didn't do it,
Whitney said through the phone. Obviously, Richard replied. But what made you change your mind, just out of curiosity? She didn't answer for a second. The sound of uncertain sighs came through the receiver several times.
Something's really wrong with that tree, Richard. I think you should get out of there.
There was only frankness and fear in her voice. "I'm not leaving my house because of some pranksters," Richard said.
Pranksters? You think that's what happened? We were pranked out of 6 minutes of time? You're delusional, Richard.
Speak for yourself.
I mean it, Richard. There's someone else there, somewhere. I don't know where or who, but you're not alone out there.
Richard shuddered. That thought scared him more than anything so far. Someone. A real person. A fear more tangible than ghost stories and pranks. He looked around his vast kitchen into the living room. All the windows were open, lights off, shadows everywhere. Silence rang. Were the doors even locked?
Richard?
Yeah?
There's more to the tape than what I put online. What sound?
Oh yeah? And by the way, thanks for putting my name on that. I didn't expect it to spread so fast. It seemed to have touched a nerve with a lot of people.
Yeah, it did. I'm no techie, but I know 3 million views in 2 days is insane. So what's missing?
Maybe you could be a real internet celebrity if you put the rest online, Richard snarked. Then suddenly he remembered Whitney's claims to rape, her claim that there was someone else there. He could guess what was on the video and suddenly regretted his choice of words. Sorry.
Sorry. You're on it too.
What's that mean?
What's your email? I'll send it.
She sounded unsure. Richard gave her his email and hung up. The beep of the phone echoed in the descending loneliness, and Richard felt an ominous feeling that he likened to an animal being hunted. A foreboding clock ticked on the wall. Should he get his shotgun? He began to get up. Silence shattered with a booming sound of knuckles on his front door. Richard jumped and may have even yelped, though he wasn't sure. He steadied himself, went to the living room. There was a large white van framed in the picture window, and to his surprise, it didn't have Evening 5 News painted on its side. He went to the door. "Good afternoon," said the bald man in white standing behind it. "My name is Father Absalom. Should have gotten a shotgun." Richard mused 2 weeks later, watching Dr. Beljovic laboriously twist the stainless steel tree core into the trunk of the olive. "What's that?" Whitney asked. "Nothing. Just wishing I'd headed this whole thing off 2 weeks ago. Could have had that tree down and into the burn pile by now, instead of having the damn thing on the verge of legal protection." He said the last 2 words in the same derisive tone that farmers used when discussing endangered snails that kept them from quality irrigation water. So this is how it felt. "Did you watch the video?" Whitney asked. Richard paused, then replied, "Yep." "And?" He felt like blushing, not looking towards the anchorwoman, but knowing she was blushing as well. "Is it real?" he asked. She paused, then said, "Yes, it is, unfortunately." Richard didn't doubt it, but he had hoped for a moment that it was all a joke, that maybe that pretty boy from TV would jump out and tell him he'd been punked or something. "How are you?" he asked. She hesitated, and in a tone which was unusually cool considering the gravity of the statement, she said, "I'm pregnant." Richard choked on nothing. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about." "But there was no one else there. There can't have been," Richard said. "I know." 2 weeks prior, Richard realized that he was really beginning to feel his age. A half hour of hammering at the keyboard, and he'd barely been able to get the video file opening. "What the hell is buffering?" he grumbled. A small movement caught the corner of his eye. Smoke? He jumped up and rushed to the picture window. Sure enough, there was a trail of smoke drifting into the sky. He rushed outside and toward the field where he could see the cultist white van parked under the tree. There were several of them, more than he thought could fit in the van, all bustling around the trunk. 2 of them were on their knees, bowing to it like tribal voodooists in an old racist action movie. Another one, the one calling himself Father, had started a small fire in a ring of stones. "Unbelievable," Richard shouted. He'd told them they could look at the tree, since their leader seemed so earnest, but he never said anything about starting a fire. This wasn't the worst time of the year for open flame in the desert. That'd be in a couple of months from then. But there never was really a good time for it. He took a step to go tell them to get lost when a noise came from inside his house. It sounded like several loud pops. He turned and listened. The computer was glowing from across the room, a light flickering against the wall behind it. The video had begun to play. The popping stopped, and another sound grew louder, moaning out of the speakers. Richard squinted. It was the sound of sex. His first thought was that Whitney had sent him porn as a joke. Glancing at the cultists, he waved his hands in annoyance and went back inside, cheeks red. The moans and grunts from the speakers rose in earnest until he reflexively looked around, just to make sure no one else was around to get the wrong idea. Then he sat down and enlarged the video. The progress bar showed halfway through, so he started it over. It started from where the internet version had first cut out, with the camera on the ground, the sagebrush blocking the view, and a tree trunk writhing in the back. A scuffle off-screen sent up a plume of dust and jerked the camera around until Richard could see his own left leg from the waist down, standing motionless against the sky, fingers of his left hand dangling from the top of the screen. More dust blew in from off-screen. A shadow moved across the ground. A brief gasp of surprise came from somewhere, and the rasping metal sound of a bullet being locked into a chamber sounded. Richard saw himself move, lunging forward toward the camera, until only his toe was visible. It looked like he was struggling with something or someone. The loud pops that caught his attention sounded again. Gunshots. The half-memory of the loud popping from those confusing moments came back, sounding just like Whitney Whittle's 32 on the computer speakers. Tinkling brass shells fell and disappeared into the dirt. He fought off the fear that maybe he had attacked Whitney Whittle. Maybe she'd tried to protect herself, but was just a bad shot. When the shooting stopped, Richard saw himself walk backwards across the frame, stopping exactly where he had stood before, except that blood now dripped from his fingers. Had he been shot? Grazed? He paused the video and held his hand up to the light. The bright red wound wasn't a bullet wound. It looked like the flesh of his palm had been pinched, as if perhaps he had grabbed the top of the slide on the semi-automatic pistol. Whoever she'd been shooting at, he'd tried to prevent it. He hit play. Nothing happened for a few moments, until the soft sounds of coitus began filtering through the speakers once again. A shadow occasionally flitted across the display. The moans grew louder, more dust drifted. Then with a lurch, the camera jostled again like it had been kicked. Now the trunk of the tree could be seen again, the vines just beginning to grow and twist. Richard saw his whole lower body now in view of the camera. In his right hand, he was holding the white panties that the detective had showed him later that day. Signs of arousal were clear in his jeans. "Oh my God," he groaned as he watched himself. Whatever was going on off-screen clearly wasn't rape. The distinct sound of consensual sex escalated into a crescendo. Along with the sounds of female satisfaction had emerged the dry, rattling sound of a distinctly male grunting. It wasn't a sound like anything Richard had ever heard before. It was terrifying, lecherous, and unnatural. Seconds later, it was over. The dust stopped drifting, the sounds died away. Richard saw himself drop the underwear behind the sagebrush just as the shadow moved again over the camera. The shadow shrank towards the tree, moved up to it. Air flooded out of Richard's lungs and his mouth dried. Weak hands involuntarily fell away from the computer desk. His bladder loosened to within inches of embarrassment, and fear, shivering, helpless terror, drained him of anything but the ability to quake and whimper. A foot came into view. It stepped in front of the tree trunk just as another like it rose up to find purchase amidst the writhing bark and vines. They were wrapped in plain, rough canvas, tied at the ankle, and they climbed the tree and disappeared, replaced by a slow, swinging shadow, swaying and twitching in the breeze. The video stopped. Richard fainted. "I've been thinking about it," Richard said, still not looking at Whitney Whittle, still staring in mock focus at the doctor at his work. "It was a prankster. Someone was in disguise in the tree when we showed up. They used some kind of smoke, vapor or something to make us forget, and then escaped when the police weren't looking. That has to be it. I mean, God knows you weren't made pregnant by a tree or an outlaw ghost. Maybe because I didn't know what they were up to, I tried to stop you from shooting them when you drew your gun. I don't know." Whitney didn't point out any of the flaws in that hypothesis. She didn't have to. She'd considered that and tried desperately not to discount it. "God, I hope so," she said. Dr. Adnan Beljovic heard the crackling first and prayed that he hadn't really screwed up by using the 10mm core rather than the 7 like he originally intended. It was risky business, drilling into old trees. Poor sterilization itself had caused the death of more than one ancient treasure. He'd always been careful, but the bark on the olive was softer than he expected, the wood harder. It almost felt like he was drilling into an eastern oak rather than a dry western olive. He honestly didn't know how it would react to the drill. The tree cracked again, louder this time, from deep inside the trunk, audible enough for everyone to hear. Father Absalom gasped, then squealed like a child on Christmas morning. "It begins," he shouted, putting his arms up in the air and looking to the sky reverently. With a bang, the back doors of the white van burst open and half a dozen sweating cultists in white bustled out, rushing the tree. Dr. Beljovic barely had time to register that they were holding ropes and assault rifles before the tree cracked and gradually began to split open. A fissure appearing in its side like it were a balloon slowly bursting. The doctor detected a scent of earthy decay and warm air gushing from the split briefly before he felt the hands of many frantic cultists grab a hold of him and toss him roughly into the dirt several yards away. Deputy Petty fought his natural inclination to draw his pistol at the onrush of fanatics, knowing that he was outmatched, but years of police training made it impossible not to grab for his belt. 2 searing blows to the gut were followed by 2 loud reports from a rifle, and he fell into the sagebrush, holding his bleeding stomach. Whitney screamed, and Richard, heroic despite himself, stepped in front of her, putting his hands up toward the cultists. Father Absalom hadn't changed positions or lowered his hands. He now spoke in a voice reminiscent of big-top cable preachers. "It begins, brothers and sisters. It is the dreams have foretold to me. The voices have spoken. The echoes of the past have rang in my humble ears. It begins again. The cycle of our world is unavoidable as it is holy, brothers and sisters." Richard stood, frightened, but couldn't help but notice that there were only brothers. There were no sisters. Moreover, most of them were pasty white and looked to have spent more time in cubicles than at altars. Razor burns still prickled on the head of the crackpot holding a gun to Richard and Whitney. What a pathetic cult, Richard thought. I'm going to get killed by a bunch of nerds. "As we have all seen," Absalom continued to bellow, "coming fractured, unwelcome through our modern minds, broken by this time and place, souls out of a world past and future, as we all have seen, subjects to ancient gods against our will and to our honor, as we have all seen in our weak minds made strong through their own perversions, holy perversions to the primitive forces, as we all have seen in our darkest hours, as the poles shift, as it wakes again, the giver of life, the holiest of spheres, as we have all seen, the cycle begins again. Let us be catalysts and forever be in the energy of this cycle. Let the stars above witness the glory of what it has achieved in us, the glorious pinnacle of its perversions." Richard wouldn't make sense of any of the babble. He watched the tree as it ceased to move, a great cleft, exposing a black cavity as though the center of the tree, which should have been little more than a shrub, had rotted out and left a hole down to its roots. The bald cultist, pointing the gun at Richard, lowered the barrel and turned around toward Father Absalom. All the others did the same. Their faces didn't show any happiness or expectation or fear. If anything, they showed resignation, maybe even relief, like someone who'd awoken from a bad dream and knew it was finally over. Dr. Beljovic had used the distraction to crawl to the police jeep and covertly slip inside. The door had been left open, for which he was grateful. He pushed himself onto the seat and found the radio on the dash. The preponderance of buttons momentarily daunted him, but he knew he only had to call for help. He pushed the button on the speaker and spoke the lines he'd seen so many times on serial police dramas. Deputy down, requesting backup." Static hissed back, and a feminine voice, all business, replied,
Report location.
I don't know exactly. I'm with Deputy Petty. He's been shot.
Copy. Reinforcements en route, the voice said.
A metallic rasp and snap caught his attention. One of the cultists had heard the static and was pointing his gun directly at the doctor. Dr. Beljovic braced for the worst. "Do not fire," Father Absalom said, looking back at the jeep. "They needn't be carried with us as unchosen baggage. They are not of its holy mind. Let them bear witness." With that, the cultists, bearing the ropes, flung them over the branches of the tree and began tying knots into the dangling ends. With blank stares and expert nimbleness, they produced a half-dozen nooses. Then, to the horror of the uninitiated, they slipped their heads in the nooses one at a time, and the remaining members of the group pulled them up individually, slowly, until they hung dancing in the air above the swirling dust. One by one this happened, the spectators not daring to move to stop it, and too entranced by the horror of it to look away. The raising of the squirming bodies became slower, more labored, more agonizing as the numbers of those living dwindled. No, not living, Richard realized. Just unhung. All the bodies hanging from the tree were still living, the squirming and dancing resuming only moments after it stopped, more frantically than before. He honestly didn't know if it was just the slow death of a gentle hanging, or the preternatural energy that surrounded the tree itself. Finally, only Father Absalom was left. He smiled serenely at the spectacle before him. "You evil lunatic!" Whitney burst out. "Why the hell are you doing this?" She rushed over to where the wounded deputy lay groaning in the dirt and drew his pistol, pointing it directly at the cult leader. Assault rifles littered the ground around the tree, but if the father had any intention of using them, he didn't show it. "You will understand soon," he said, wet eyes carrying his unsteady gaze toward her. "You are part of it now. It is in you, though truly it is in all of us. But you carry it." He pointed toward her midsection. "What are you talking about?" Whitney asked in a weak voice. "You know. It has told me. It tells me many things because it loves me. But you will understand soon. It begins again." With those words, Father Absalom turned and walked toward the division in the tree. He glistened with the sweat of exertion from heaving the final cult member into the air on his own, but he walked with a light step. The men hanging from the tree continued to squirm and dance. As he crossed into the shadow of the empty tree, Father Absalom seemed to sink into the earth. "Where are you Richard began, but a feeling came over him, beginning at his feet. He felt tired, exhausted, as if he'd run a marathon and stayed awake for 6 days. It was exactly the opposite of the feeling from 2 weeks ago. Then he remembered nothing. Richard came to with a gasp, heard Whitney and the doctor's sharp intake of breath nearby as they awoke simultaneously. There was no telling how much time had passed, but none of them had moved. The corpses hanging from the tree only swayed in the breeze. Richard gathered his senses. Despite feeling like he could use a nap, the feeling of tiredness had gone away. "How's Cop?" he asked weakly. "Alive," Whitney replied after resuming her inspection. "But barely." "Help is on the way," Dr. Beljovic said, reclining in the driver's side of the jeep. "Should we cut him down?" Richard asked, pointing to the hanging cultists. "To hell with them," Whitney said. Richard started to protest, but then a face peered from the shadow of the crack in the tree. It was Father Absalom. From his expression, Richard could tell that something was wrong. He didn't look pleased. Confusion shifted to anger, then to despair. The would-be priest thrust his arms back out of the trunk, grabbing onto the rough bark along the fissure. "No!" he gasped. "It's gone! She's gone!" Why? Richard stepped forward but then stopped. He expected to see the bald man, entwined in vines, get violently pulled back into the tree, screaming and gasping like in a B-horror movie. But that didn't happen. Slowly, almost painfully, Father Absalom emerged from the shadows. His feet were black with wet soil, tears streaming down his face. He collapsed to the ground in the sun, whimpering. "No love," he said, and then repeated, "No love, no love, nothing. Why is there nothing?" Richard went towards him. The sound of a helicopter approached. Father Absalom looked at Richard with more honesty in his expression than he ever had before. "It left," he sobbed. "She cares nothing. Not love, not even hate. Worse, I was not accepted." He looked back at the darkness inside the tree. "Not even rejected. Ignored." Despite everything, Richard felt the urge to kneel on his side and comfort the crying man, but he didn't. What could he say? He didn't even know what the maniac was babbling about, and he had just murdered 6 people. So Richard just stood there and listened to the helicopter getting louder. With a crack, one of the branches broke. The men, hanging at the furthest end, fell to the ground, tree branch atop them. Another crack, and the other men dropped with a sickening crunch. Leaves fluttered to the ground in an autumn-like cascade. "What's happening?" Richard asked Father Absalom, but the sniveling cult leader didn't respond. He turned to the doctor in the jeep, but Dr. Beljovic had climbed out and was waving into an approaching medical helicopter. Whitney had dropped the pistol and was putting pressure on Deputy Petty's wounds. Richard alone watched the tree die. Father Absalom cried to himself, "Give up! We are as rocks, dirt. There is no sanctuary in the life of man. It comes despite us. Give up! It is coming!" Richard kicked him. Whitney Whittle lay on her couch, recovering from the procedure. The reproductive clinic was just across the street from Deputy Petty's hospital room, and Richard had driven back for a visit after her, dropping her off. Despite it all, she felt a twinge of guilt. The doctor had said that the fetus would never have survived anyway, given the extent of its apparent disfigurements, but she wasn't so sure. She'd never been pro-choice, but in her head she knew that she had done the right thing. The phone rang and she answered it. It was work.
"Hey, got a scoop for you. You feeling up to a trip?"
"It might be soon. What's the gig?" It had been a long week and she was happy to get her mind back on her job.
"Looks like another viral video like the tree. This one's in England."
"I'm going to stop you right there."
Now hold on. I know you're still a little off from that whole crazy shootout thing, but that's what makes you the resident expert. King 6 requested you personally.
Whitney hesitated. "King 6? Regional?"
"National even. What do you say?"
"Give me the link. I'll check it out, but no promises."
"It's already in your inbox."
The video had a voiceover with a Cockney tinge. It told of an ancient figure called Green Man, a fairy kind of creature that represented the spirit of nature. It then went on to tell of how yew trees were sacred and that the particular tree in the video had a special history of being home to the Green Man entity. Most thought it was ancient superstition, but now the branches and vines twisted into the visage of a wise old man that made Whitney think of the wizards from Tolkien's fantasy sagas. The Green Man looked placidly around the acorn eyes as the foliage pulsated. The video had 2 million hits and climbing, and Whitney could see why. She felt a strong surge of something energizing as she watched it, like an after-workout slump being broken by a rush of endorphins. The video zoomed out. In the background, there were people dressed in robes with leaves in their hair. They stood in a circle, awkwardly chanting something that sounded like it came straight out of Middle-earth. One of them, in the middle, was pregnant. The pagans had started to gather. Whitney scrolled down. A new video had been posted. The title read, Tulpa Tree. Buddha effigy appears under banyan. Must see. This one took place in India. The still frame featured a pixelated image of a fat man made of leaves and branches, sitting serenely under a tree. Whitney exited the browser and shut off her computer with trembling hands. She wasn't going anywhere. She wouldn't have to. Pretty soon, the whole world would know that it was here.
Chilling tales for dark nights.